Welcome to the first day of the WSA Digital Festival, which the theme is architecture and politics. So the morning event will feature two young independent architecture group who have shown the impact that they create, and that is only from architectural students. So we're going to start off with a talk from FAF. So I'm now going to pass it off to Charlie Edmonds.
Thank you. Yeah, so what I'd like to do to kind of kick off this sort of overview of some of our work and a bit about who FAF are, how we got started, what we've done, why we think more of this kind of work should be done, is I'm actually going to leave all that for a little bit and start off by going a little bit into history and telling you a little bit about my favorite architect. So I would love to hear, I don't know if anyone wants to drop this in the chat or something, but if anyone knows who this is, I would love to hear. I would love to hear how many people have heard of this guy, if anyone, because he's absolutely not a very well-known figure in history, let alone within architecture. So his name was Roel Wallenberg, and he was a Swedish architect who was born in 1912. And some of his most significant contributions to the world included perhaps the only justified example of unpaid work, a situation where he fit 35,000 people into a 5,000 occupancy building and used his design background to create counterfeit government documents. So he does not have what you would call the typical portfolio of a respected architect. And yet I hope that by the time I've introduced him, you'll see why both myself and so many other people hold this man in such high regard. So being born in 1912, Wallenberg was living through a quite turbulent time in history. So he studied architecture at the University of Michigan, and he was about as privileged as a person could be at this time. He had family who were diplomats, high-ranking bankers, government officials. He was about as well-connected as you can be. And yet he had a sort of drive to try and move beyond as much as he could the sort of protective boundaries that this privilege grants you. So he spent a great deal of his time in the US hitchhiking around the country, which led to him getting robbed several times. And he did all this in an attempt to understand the world beyond his what was immediately visible to him. And he took all of these experiences as a kind of training as to how to interact with people and how to organize and engage with others and how to act in situations of high tension, stress, conflict, and strife. So once again, not the sort of story that you hear about many architects, but what he did with this sort of unconventional path to becoming an architect was that when he went back to Sweden, he found himself in a situation where, due to the war, due to the conflict in the world in the early 20th century. There was an awful economy, and as I'm sure many of us today can appreciate, this meant that he was limited in terms of how he could engage with the world with his discipline of architecture. So what he did was he took these skills and he brought them to a job of diplomacy and international sort of engagement. So Wallenberg traveled to Hungary, to Budapest in 1944, which was at the height of Nazi occupation of this city. And he decided that what he was going to do was he was going to do as much as he could as an individual to help the people of this city, particularly Jewish people of this city, and intervene as a political entity as well as an architect. So 3 key ways that he did this was, like I said, he shows us perhaps the only justified example of unpaid work, where as a diplomatic figure, he essentially negotiated with the Swedish ambassador and consulate that he should be given freedom to make decisions spontaneously and quickly, and without having to go through typical bureaucratic processes. So he started hiring Jewish people in Budapest who were not Swedish citizens. He started hiring them as diplomatic employees, which granted them immunity to being taken to death camps. So by doing this, he was saving people's lives and doing all of this through a political, semi-legal process of granting this employment to Hungarian citizens. He took 35,000 people who were in a process of being removed from the city by German soldiers, and he essentially started to just requisition buildings and declare that they were Swedish diplomatic buildings. So again, this man he didn't know if he had the authority to do this, but he knew that there was a dire need for people to be saved and for people to do this kind of work. So he just declared that several buildings were now part of this Swedish diplomatic space. And then using his architectural background, he remodeled all of these buildings that would have typically only fit 5,000 people to accommodate 35,000. So he's sheltering an overwhelming number of people in these diplomatic spaces by using this combination of political engagement and architectural training. And then finally, perhaps the greatest contribution he was able to make in terms of saving lives during this period was by creating counterfeit government documents. So Wallenberg had really studied and understood a lot of the political realities of the time that he lived in. And one thing that he'd realized in particular was that fascists love fancy stamps and they love symbols of authority, and there's a lot of bureaucracy and ingrained obedience to authority within this group. So he started to create these documents called Schutzpass, which was basically a kind of diplomatic passport. And he gave them these really garish colors. He put stamps all over them. He put these symbols on them of the crowns. None of these meant anything. These were all, this was essentially a sort of graphic exercise in trying to fool people into believing that you had some sort of authority and protection. And it was overwhelmingly successful. So during his time in Budapest, Wallenberg created and distributed thousands and thousands and thousands of these Schutzpass documents. And again, it's an incredible combination of political engagement, humanitarian work with a background in architectural training. It's a really unique situation where these two things have come together in an incredibly effective and historically significant way. So these reasons and the sort of the risk that this man was willing to take, the fact that he moved beyond the typical comfortable constraints of his own privilege, the reasons why Raoul Wallenberg is my favorite architect and someone that I think should be known by every architect and every person, to be honest, because the work that he did was nothing short of heroic. And he's remembered in many, many, many ways. You can go and see his memorial in Marble Arch. And you might be wondering at this point, well, what on earth does this have to do with us today? And I think this quote really captures why I wanted to introduce the session today by telling you the story of Raoul Wallenberg. It's from Gideon Halsner, who was the Israeli Attorney General, and he said, "Here is a man who had the choice of remaining in secure, neutral Sweden when Nazism was ruling Europe. Instead, he left his haven and went to what was then one of the most perilous places in Europe, Hungary. And for what? To save Jews. He won his battle, and I feel that in this age, when there is so little to believe in, so very little on which our young people can pin their hopes and ideals, he is a person to show to the world which knows so little about him. That is why I believe the story of Raoul Wallenberg should be told and his figure in all its true proportions projected into human minds." So the work that this man did, though not very well known, I think should be formational to any architect, any designer who's interested in how we as a profession engage with the world in a political, humanitarian sense. And that part of that quote, which talks about how little young people have to pin their ideals on, resonated very, very much with me personally, because at the moment, our sort of windows into the world, which for many of us will be our phones, the way that we primarily learn information about what is happening in the world around us, it can feel overwhelming a lot of times. We face a sort of unique combination of existential threats, from climate change to extreme intergenerational inequality, which is harming millennials and people from Generation Z, to even recent news about inequity being compounded by decisions at the very, very top. Even at a more micro level, when we look at things that are directly related to us as architectural professionals, we have privatization going on in our cities, a expansion of privately owned space, which is intruding on public ownership. We have the housing crisis, which many of us will have felt the consequences of personally. And we have a context of employment, which currently hits the youngest people the hardest. So why then is it still so rare? Why is it still so unconventional to hear about politics in architecture? Well, this comes out, I think, this apathy, I think, is most well reflected when we look at things like elections for RIBA Council, RIBA President, etc. So turnout for the last council election was 9.6%. So out of all of the people that had the option to vote and influence the largest sort of body of architects within the UK, 9.6% of people made their voice and their position heard in that decision-making process. So what is the source of this apathy? Why do things like RIBA elections, why do discussions around the political agency of architects and designers, why are these things so buried? Well, my personal theory is that it's a matter of privilege. So a recent report on the creative sector found that architects have the highest percentage of privilege of any creative industry. So this includes everyone from scientists to therapists to environmental professionals to marketing people. And architects are right at the very top. And I believe that it's this sort of general position of comfort that most of us live in that allows many, many, many architects to step back from the world of politics, activism, engagement, because at the end of the day, we will be okay in regardless of what happens in many of these sort of discussions. So how can we try and push back against this? How can we try and push back against this sense of apathy and this sense of comfort? Because Roel Wallenberg showed us that privilege does not have to mean inaction. You can do incredible, incredible things from a position of privilege. So how do we take this situation and how do we try and move towards a more equitable profession and one which is more engaged in the enormous challenges that we're facing in the 21st century? Well, obviously, that is an enormous, enormous question. And I'm not going to try and act like I have the sole solution to it, but I can tell you a bit about what we tried to do. So for those of you who haven't heard of FAF or Future Architects Front before, I'll give you a brief overview of who we are. So often we are sort of given a few different labels, from grassroots movements to social media page to advocacy group. And I will typically just say, yes, we are all of those things whenever someone tries to kind of put us in a category. But really, what we are is we are a group of young practitioners, students, researchers, designers, architects who are trying to campaign against exploitation and the lack of equity within the profession. So what have we done? Well, we started our sort of existence by looking at the state of the profession and wondering if our sense of unease, our sense of unhappiness with the state of the profession was justified. So to figure out if other people shared our concerns, we created a survey which asked, are you currently employed? Have you ever worked unpaid overtime? Does your salary allow you to live comfortably? Have you seen vacancies for architectural assistants that require you to have years of professional experience? Have you ever felt exploited by your employer in practice? And do you feel supported by REBA? And we found that overwhelmingly people shared our concerns about the profession, which often revolved around conditions like unpaid overtime and support from large governmental architectural bodies like the REBA. So we decided to take all of this data and also gather personal experiences from people as well. So we asked people to share their personal experiences of working in architecture. And we ended up with a list of over 100 stories of how people felt that the profession was currently not serving them in the way they wanted it to, and they weren't able to participate in the profession in the way that they wanted to. And all of these experiences led us to formulate 5 sort of key demands that we felt were echoed throughout all of the different experiences that we came across. So those 5 demands were to end unpaid overtime, to create better oversight for the architectural assistant role, to introduce greater transparency in the REBA's budget and spending, to create a more representative governing body in the REBA, and to have better mechanisms of accountability for exploitative practices. So these demands came together in an open letter that we wrote to the Royal Institute of British Architects. And the reason that we looked to the REBA in particular was not so much that we thought that they could just snap their fingers and fix the profession. It was more of a sort of strategic decision in the sense that REBA have chartered practices who agree to their professional codes of conduct and to their codes of practice. So unlike a lot of business, where the only way to control the way that business works is through policymaking and regulation, the REBA have an interesting sort of power to create that sort of regulation and legislation by themselves. So we saw the REBA as a really sort of ideal group for us to try and leverage to create the change that we wanted to see, because a significant proportion of UK architects are chartered with the REBA. So these decisions could, while they would not say end unpaid overtime in the entire country for every architect, it could end unpaid overtime for a really, really significant number of people working in the architecture profession. So we released this document and we put it out as an open letter for people to sign. And we ended up getting over 1,800 signatures in the space of a couple of weeks. So this was overwhelming for us because we were really not expecting the letter to gain the amount of traction that it did. And the huge outpouring of support for the topics that we were talking about, the letter that we'd written, it created a huge amount of momentum for us to sort of create more pressure, more political pressure to enact the demands that we have and the changes that we wanted to see. So you might be wondering, well, how did we actually do this? How did we get the open letter out there? How did we get enough eyes on it? How did we build up this sort of momentum and support? And the answer is actually, we did it through the internet. We did it through memes. We did it through social media and very, very contemporary, typically informal channels. So you might be looking at these and think, oh, well, that's very lowbrow. I don't know if I would personally run a campaign that way. And I would say, yeah, you're right. It is lowbrow, but that's the point. The point is that we're taking these big, complex, sort of really important issues, and we're condensing them into an image which is both easily, immediately understood, but also very shareable, very easy for people to sort of spread the message of what we're trying to do through. Because how many of you have sent a meme to a friend, and how many of you have sent a 5,000 word essay to a friend? There's certain ways that are very, very well tailored towards building support for a movement today. And as important as the open letter was, that was not the way to necessarily spread awareness. That was the vehicle through which we expressed our intent. So a huge part of the trajectory of FAF has been all down to using these contemporary ways of communicating, these contemporary ways of hosting spaces and sharing opinions and experiences and connecting with people, using this sort of contemporary digital landscape that we have to build support for what is, at the end of the day, a political activist end goal of creating grassroots change within a profession. So this very lowbrow social media approach eventually got to the point where there were enough eyes on our work and enough support for the open letter that we were written about several times in the AJ, and we were able to contribute to sort of workshops and presentations at universities. And the first article about our open letter was the most popular piece on the AJ for a week or two, if I remember rightly. So this process, which was all done through a phone, all done through writing, creating social media pages, it generated an enormous amount of momentum for the campaign that we were running. And it eventually led to the AJ running their own investigation into the sort of current conditions of working as an architectural assistant in the UK today. And I would encourage people to go read this article because it's full of a lot of not only a lot of great analysis in the problems that we face today, but also a lot of great recommendations about how you can come together with other people in your position to create better circumstances for yourself. So this is a really, really important piece of reading for any young person in architecture. And it's not behind a paywall or anything, so anyone can read it. So the end result of this work was that we ended up meeting with the REBA, and we got the REBA to agree to several of our demands and to commit to bringing them into policy. So we got the REBA to agree to consult on making it mandatory that REBA practices remunerate people for overtime. We got them to agree to make the use of the compact mandatory for charter practices, and the compact is a sort of new standard agreement between university, student, and practice that hopes to create a more equitable relationship between those parties. So that will become mandatory once it's finished its pilot phase. We got them to agree to adopt the REBA Inclusion Charter as a mandatory requirement rather than something that can be opted in or out of. And we also got them to agree to improving their accountability mechanisms so that if there are problems that architectural assistants are facing while employed in practice, then they have the right support and mechanisms to whistleblow or get support in resisting any forms of exploitation that may come up during their time in practice. So this was a big sort of culmination of our early work, was getting these agreements from the REBA. And we went on to also look at universities and education. And this was a really fascinating experience because we created this fairly comprehensive education survey to try and, again, ask people what they thought was sort of the current state of architectural education. And we got 532 respondents from 48 different UK architecture schools. And I won't share all of this data with you, but the standout things that we learned through this process was that if we ask people if they're satisfied with their experience of architectural education, we get almost a perfect split of yes, no, and unsure. So really no consensus on if architectural education is a positive experience. But what we do find consensus on is 92.5% of people thinks that it needs to change. So this suggests that even people who had a positive experience still thinks that there is some way that the system needs to change. And the way that we sort of interpreted this data was that there's a huge appetite for change. There's a huge appetite for something new. And yet people are completely evenly split on what it is that needs to change. So we also asked for people to give written responses to this survey as well. And I think this response really captures the meaning of this data. And the response was, education needs less dogma, less focus on ticking boxes on a mark scheme, more focus on process rather than just producing beautiful drawings and images. Architecture is a practice that goes beyond buildings, but also looks at systems in a social, cultural, and political setting. Not saying that construction should not be taught, but there should be more diversity and choice to follow different paths, a more diverse set of professors and tutors. So we essentially interpreted the data that we gathered as not so much a call for a across the board change in how architecture is taught, but instead greater heterogeneity in the educational landscape. So more support for people who are interested in things like politics and architecture, more support for people who are interested in maybe sort of going into academia or research or policy, these kinds of things. So we were then able to sort of look at how, architecture, as many of you will know, covers so many different sort of topics in one way or another, and that these are all areas that potentially people could have sharper focuses on through their education rather than it being a one component of many. So more heterogeneity, more diversity in education, and more of an ability for people to focus on the areas of the profession that they really feel resonate with them and what they want to achieve. And this process, similar to what happened with the open letter and REBA, led us to begin talks with the ARB. And we're now in a position where the ARB are in the process of consulting and proposing reforms on how they regulate architectural education and the standards that they will set for someone to be registered and qualified as an architect. So we now have, thanks to this survey and thanks to this sort of online participation, we now also have a relationship with the ARB that can hopefully be used as, again, another political avenue through which we can create a sort of grassroots change. So if I could sort of sum up what I'm trying to convey in a nice little box, it's that there's so much potential today for collective empowerment through sharing. We have never had more potential to connect and interact with each other. There's never been better infrastructure for that than there is today. And we have so much room through which we can build solidarity, create grassroots movements, and create the change we want to see as young people in architecture. We're just one example of how that's been done. We aren't the example of how it should be done. We aren't definitive of this approach. But I hope that through hearing about what we've done, you can begin to imagine ways that you might be able to engage with things like politics, activism within the profession in some way. And sometimes this can feel really overwhelming. It's a lot to ask of people to put their head up and say, I don't agree with this. I think this should change. And so I think that a really great way to get involved with this kind of work is to sort of just surround yourself with voices that you agree with and that you believe are doing important work to create this kind of change that you want to see. So here is a few examples of accounts, people that I would follow and stay up to date on. So groups like Fame, who you will very likely have heard of, who are doing amazing sort of research about racial equity in the profession and gender equity. They are an amazing resource to build your awareness of the problems and the way that we can address these problems. Groups like UVW SAW, the first sort of architectural union that we've had for a little while, founded in only 2019, I believe. They're only 2 years old, but already they've created a huge impact and a huge drive for unionization within the profession. There's also groups like ACAN, who are sort of spearheading climate justice and how we as architects should be responding to the climate crisis. So there's so many groups who are showing how politics and architecture can work together, not just in theory, but also in practice. All of these people, all of these groups have created change in some way or another. So one of the last things I'll leave you with is this screenshot that I took 4 days after creating the FAF Instagram page. So after 4 days of existing on social media, on Instagram, we had no physical presence. We had no office. We hadn't been able to do any protests because it was the middle of the pandemic. Purely digital work. 4 days after that, we got a message from Reba asking to meet and discuss the things that we were talking about. So it it seems like a really overwhelming, really impossible challenge to do this kind of work, but you would be shocked at how quickly you can see results and how quickly you can make an impact on the issues that you care about. And then the last thing I'll say is there's a couple of quotes that resonate a great deal with me when I think about this kind of work, and I think about how we can try and empower more people to participate in this kind of work. And that is one quote from Tatjana Schneider and Jeremy Till, which says, "We should refuse the portrayal of architects as powerless victims of the process of building production and other global forces, and instead become our own agents of progressive politics." And another quote from Catherine Heron, which says, "Architects have to work from a political base, and if there isn't one, you have to start it." So hopefully this will resonate with a lot of you as much as it does with me. And I'm very, very, very optimistic about the near future and how particularly young people, particularly students, are going to be able to take our digital literacy, our awareness of political issues and problems that we face, and create grassroots networks and organizations to try and respond to and address these problems. So I will leave that there. Thank you very, very much for being here.
Thank you so much, Charlie. That was really helpful. Before this event started, we did gather series of questions through several social media platforms. So I was going to ask some to you. As you mentioned, unpaid overtime. So you kind of addressed that through the open letter, but it seems to be still kind of quite an issue. And you mentioned that there were the compact. Could you talk more about that and its applications?
Yeah, so basically at the moment, when you start working for an architecture practice, there's no standard contract or anything that you sign. Sometimes they don't even give you a contract, which, an FYI, you should always have a contract. And so what that means is that your employer sets the conditions of your work. So they can ask you, for example, to opt out from the working time directive, which limits the amount of overtime you can work. And another FYI, if your employer asks you to do that, you don't have to, and they are not allowed to not hire you if you say you don't want to opt out of that. And if they do change their mind, then you can take them to an employment tribunal. So but regardless, there's a lot of things in the contract that are weighted towards the benefit of the employer rather than the employee. So the compact is a new sort of agreement proposed by the REBA between the architectural assistant, the employer, and the university, because fundamentally the architectural assistant position is still supposed to be part of your education. You're still seen as a student in that position. So it's basically an agreement that sets out in more clarity the commitments that each of these groups have to one another, because sometimes there's a lack of awareness about, for example, how should your practice be educating you while you work there? What sort of obligations does your practice have to you as an architectural assistant? So the compact is essentially a way of clarifying all of these gray spaces and making sure that everyone is aware of and commits to the obligations that they have to one another in this sort of working relationship.
Thank you. That's very clear. Another question. So, regarding making awareness, would you say the educating the legislatives and the RIP system should be within the architectural educations in universities, or would that be a bit too much?
I mean, you know, we have usually we have modules on things like management practice and law, right? So, for me, something that I would love to see more of in universities is more engagement with principles of employment rights, unionization, and the sort of political landscape of architecture, because there is a political landscape. We have the REBA, we have the ARB, we have SCOSA, the Society of the Heads of all the schools of architecture. We have these bodies that exist as political entities. And, I think it's really important that more people are aware of them, because the more people are aware of them, the more engagement they get. The more engagement they get, the more representative they become as organizations. And the more representative they become as organizations, the better of an impact they can have. So I think that, it's really, really important for these things to become higher priorities, particularly within a university setting. And, for example, a lot of like MPL courses, management practice and law courses, are taught from the perspective of a practice owner. So you're taught to think about these topics as, someone who runs their own practice, has to do their own books, do their own accounting, think about costs, expenditure, hiring people. So you're asked to get into the head of a boss, basically, but you're not asked to do the same thing within that, to imagine yourself in the position of a worker. And, if you just think like statistically, you're going to be a worker most of your professional life, unless you're one of the lucky few who can, start a successful practice in their 20s. That's just quantitatively the more relevant, more important perspective to teach people about. So I'd love to see more sort of coverage of both of those aspects, both the governance and the worker point of view in university education.
Great, that's great. Another question that I had. Oh, there's also some questions on the Q&A. So for Arno mentioned that the firm that he's working in does not have an overtime in the contract, but instead has time off in lieu. Do you think that's considered a sensible replacement for overtime, or is that an opportunity for exploitation?
It depends a lot on how it's implemented, because so I think if it's very sort of respectful of your time, like if you work an hour of overtime and you get an hour of like holiday or something back, I think that's fair, as long as you're consenting to it. That's the main thing. Like if your contract says 40 hours, you should be able to say, I only want to work 40 hours. So I think that it's all about how it's implemented. Like I know people who have time off in lieu policies that are great and very respectful of their time and the amount of energy and commitment that they should be putting in on a day-to-day basis. But I've also heard examples where people have to apply to like justify getting time off in lieu, even if they have worked many, many hours of overtime. And then it's not necessarily like a 1 hour to 1 hour basis. Like they might work 20 hours of overtime and get 5 hours time off in lieu, for example. So I think it all depends on how it's implemented. I think it absolutely can be a fair form of remuneration for overtime, but yeah, it's all about how it's implemented, I think.
Thank you. Another question that we had is regards to architecture and mental health. So, of course, in recent COVID, it has been a lot more difficult. Any change impacts everyone differently. So, is there a way to kind of address mental health within the system, or is that something to be looked at?
Yeah, I think it's hugely important to think about mental health when we talk about these things, because but it's also important to sort of be aware of how the conversation is framed, because one thing when we were beginning FAF that like frustrated me was so if you know about the Future Architects group in Reba, that was where we got our name from. We basically wanted to poke fun at them, which was kind of juvenile, but there you go. But the Future Architects group, I remember being very frustrated when I saw that they had a webinar that was about, it was trying to address mental health, but it was doing it through the form of giving people advice on how to cope with stress, for example, how to cope with anxiety, this kind of things. And I just remember being so frustrated that, like, why are we talking about coping with stress? Why are we talking about coping with anxiety when we could be talking about why are we all so anxious and stressed? Like, why are we trying to like dampen the symptoms rather than looking at what is actually causing these problems? So I think the conversation around mental health is incredibly important, but I think that we have to be very wary of how it's framed, because a lot of the time it's framed in a way that says, it's your responsibility. If you're having sort of mental health issues, it's because of you and you need to figure that out, when really we need to be looking at, what are the environmental conditions that are leading to this as well. So yeah, I think it's really, really important, but I also think we need to be aware of how it's sometimes used to deflect responsibility away from people who are creating hostile professional conditions as well.
Thank you. There is another comment. So, keeping in mind that many university tutors do come from practice background, how much of an influence do you think that existing culture created by teaching and learning within architecture school has the poor practice within the industry?
Yeah, it's funny because it's always sort of it's always sort of framed as like, bad practice, is that influencing bad education, or bad education, is that influencing bad practice? And like, I think it's kind of like an Ouroboros. I think it's like a snake eating its own tail, where it's like it's all swirling around the drain, like it's all causing the problems and being affected by the problems, and then causing the problems more. Not to like get into university shade throwing or anything, but like take the recent news from like UCL, for example, like that I think is a great example of how like a university can have a unhealthy sort of educational environment, while so that will go on to influence how certain people practice. But then also you have people who are design tutors who bring their own practice culture into the university. So I think it's really just like a self kind of perpetuating problem. And I think what I would say is one of the most important things for universities to think about is, do you hire design tutors because they've done great design work and then you just let them become teachers? Or do you think about, does someone who is from a renowned design firm, for example, are they inherently a good teacher? Are they inherently a good educator? My answer would be no. My answer would be that they are not inherently good educators. So we need to think about how, why aren't there more sort of resources and mechanisms through which we actually think about how design tutors are working as educators, rather than just these sort of like figures that are put there, on sort of like a continuation of like the great man theory, where it's like, oh, you just learn from just being in their very presence. It's not realistic. It's not how education really works. So I would love more of a sort of awareness and internal sort of staff like and recruitment mechanisms around that sort of awareness.
That's great, because the evening discussion, the evening panel we are going to be looking at the education system, so which should be featured in our course. So we did gather a lot more questions, but we are also going to bring them up later this evening. But for now, we're going to have to wrap up with the FAF. So thank you so much for that.